everyone. Welcome to Foresight's Neurotech group. I'm really excited today to have Zan Huang here. And then you'll be discussing adapting neurological structures for AI. So you're bridging both of the topics that many people in Foresight care a lot about, which is the neurotech topic of really this group, and then the AI topic that has become more and more a part of the group.
Yeah.
So thanks a lot for your wonderful work. Thanks a lot for joining us. I'll be in the chat monitoring for questions. And without further ado, please take it away.
Thank you. All right. So I'm talking about today adapting neurological structures to artificial intelligence. And it's a very hot topic recently because we're both very interested in biology. And we're interested in biology because it gives us a glimpse of AI safety and how we actually process natural intelligence. But the most fascinating part about what I'm about to present is the fact that I think this is something deeply grounded in physics. And I recall being at the AI safety and whole brain emulation event in May, and there were actually quite a few people who are not so convinced that we should build brain-based AI or neuro AI. And part of what I want to do here is to provide the justification on some sort of recording where I can actually prove to you, or hopefully convince to you, that this is a physical and mathematical principle of intelligence, and that when we're dealing with biology, we're actually working with a very particular case of it. And so before anything, I'm going to talk about what neuro AI is, and I'm also going to give you an introduction to how thermodynamics and entropic ideas relate to all of this our AI work that is currently being done. And so I think the first question we have to ask is, what is neuro AI? And what I want to stress is all three of these points are critical to neuro AI. The first one being that the brain or the mind processes information with lots of different pathways. And these are bespoke pathways that all have their own task and function. For example, we can take the example of ventral and dorsal, which is object detection or motion detection. Left and right, when you perceive the world initially, your very field of vision, left and right, is actually split, and you're processing the world through the two different lobes independently before they merged later in the visual stream. You're working with Broca-Wernicke areas, which are processing either semantics or syntax or semantics of language, and your brain is even further divided into substreams of these streams as well. So there's something interesting about how streamification is happening. The second point is that it learns largely without supervision. And what I mean by this is we're not just giving it labels or labeled data. In fact, what's going on is a horse is born out of its womb and it's able to run within minutes. It's able to make a good prediction of its own environment without labeling and build a really good role model of what it's trying to see and predict future moments in time. And finally, the third part of neuro AI, which I think is very critical and less talked about, is that the different streams we use to process information have to actually be stacked hierarchically. There is this really beautiful sort of governing motif that's replicated to create AI. And this is currently a very explored idea because you have transformer models and we're stacking them to create these large language models. And that is a repetitive motif. But the question is, how can we actually get to the repetitive motif that's responsible for the best definition for general intelligence that's true in either biological systems, in different types of biology, and in AI? And so our motivation here is to combine all three of these different tasks into one framework, and that's what I'm going to call neuro AI. It's designing this model based on foundational architecture that separate and merges streams so that we actually create lifelike intelligence. And this is intelligence that can reason without the need for language. And it's a model that can actually be robust to certain types of tasks that machine learning models tend to fall prey to. For example, categorizing objects. How you can throw an image with a bunch of pixels or a video with a bunch of pixels and your AI algorithm will be completely tripped up. So how do we actually prevent that? How can we create something that's really robust? And so now this is where I'm going to make this very surprise pivot. I'm going to start talking about physics and ontology. And this is something that people don't usually associate with AI or biology, but I think this is where I'm going to start. And this is where I'm going to pivot here, whereas what is science, or what is the very structure of science itself? And I think this problem, science can be broken down into two main facets. The first is it's very empirical. It's empiricism. We're taking evidence and we're taking prior data that we gather to find a sort of structure of the world. and to intuit about the world. And there isn't really this that we can deduce just from basic axioms what the world is supposed to act like or behave. We have to actually start with a blank slate. And this position is actually very closely aligned with a lot of the ideas in modern day neural networks, where we want to start off with a blank slate and we want to develop this model that doesn't take any priors. It just learns based on what we have seen. And the second sort of main idea in science, the opposite pole, is rationalism. That reason and knowledge are the key components to understanding, that the world can be reasoned about through axioms. And that's actually a triumph over just simply observing the world, that we can mathematically or derive the nature of reality. And so the question is, what is AI doing, or AI today? Where is it focused? Where's the lean? And I believe that AI is too strongly empiricist. And actually, we have moved away from this rationalistic base. And the reason why I say this is throughout AI history, it's always been this tug and war between connectionism and symbolic systems. In the early days, some people are highly connectionist, which means that they like neural networks or cybernetic systems or self-adjusting systems that are connected in intricate graphs. Or you'd be on the symbolic system camp, where you think that symbolic manipulation and logic, mathematical logic, actually form the basis for intelligence, and that AI systems should be built like Lisp machines. And this kind of never stops, because even after connectionism wins out, you have modern issues such as LLM scaling versus design considerations. How much of it is just putting lots of data and having it learn? And how much of this is actually careful design of the architecture you're working with? Or when we measure performance increase on these standard benchmarks that we talked about, but the question is, what is actually being measured in these benchmarks? And I think the recent example of this that's really powerful to me is the ARC challenge, where it's very precise about what's being measured. And that's not necessarily true of, for example, having an LLM work on a law bar exam test or graduate entrance exam. That's not very clear what is exactly being measured. In fact, even when it applies to humans, it's not very clear what's being measured all the time. Hence the problem with standardized testing. And finally, this essay, which I really do not like, and this will be a little controversial, but it's an essay called The Bitter Lesson by Richard Sutton, who was one of the founders of reinforcement learning and wrote this really famous reinforcement learning book called Sutton and Bartow. And in this essay, he argues that, in fact, scaling and repetitive design and large amounts of data have always won out against careful design. And I think this is a very dangerous thing to say, because part of what science is striving to do is to actually create an understanding of what we're building, so that we can actually build much better systems. We can get to the heart of the issue. We can build things that actually work in all cases. And this is why I want to start talking about informational physics. And I want people to bring in more elements of physics and of foundational studies into to talk about intelligence and about AI and biology. First thing, we're going to talk about informational physics and physical chemistry. And we're going to take ideas from statistical mechanics, as there are laws of thermodynamics, and these are very foundational laws to how particles interact and move and how systems behave. And most obviously, you have the first law, which is relating energy to heat and work. And you have the third law of thermodynamics, where we start getting more abstract concepts like entropy. And actually, when Planck was coming up, or the German physicists that were coming up with the word for entropy, they deliberately chose a word that was very vague and not necessarily intuitive. For example, the fact that time and space are intertwined in a mesh net is not a very intuitive idea either. And a lot of the things in physics we work with aren't immediately intuitive to us. Yet, in the third law of thermodynamics, we start talking about entropy, which is a measure of disorder. And that's a very physical idea, but it's also a very abstract one. How the heck are we supposed to talk about disorder when that in itself is an abstract idea? So we come up with this term and we say, okay, cool, here's entropy. And let's take, for example, omega and Boltzmann's constant and actually create a way to measure the entropy of a system based on how many possible states or microstates it could occupy. And then Shannon comes around, and on the left is a picture of me with Cloud Shannon. There's a little statue on the campus where I am. And you start getting information and entropy, which is a non-physical idea. It's about it was originally designed for the problems of channel coding. And this is used in information passing or even horse racing, right? Or horse betting. And using a lot of this is disorder or uncertainty about information used in a completely different way. And it's not a physical definition of this information. Yet, if you take, for example, if you take this graph here that I put, there's a 0 byte or there's a 1 byte. And based on how certain you are of the binary state, you're either you have a very high entropy when you're not very sure. You're very impartial about whether it is 0 or 1. Or when you're very certain, the entropy is very low because you're very certain about it. So there's less disorder, there's less uncertainty. So how do we reconcile as abstract and physical? And we begin by saying, this is also a statement I love, and it's that information is a fundamentally physical concept. So let's take the most basic way to store information. So how do we actually have a 0 and 1 in any system? How do we actually create a binary system? Let's imagine we have a gas chamber. And it happens that this gas chamber is called the Szilard's engine, in which you basically have n atoms of gas on one side, and you have no atoms on the other side. And that makes it very concrete that if the atoms are on the left side, then it's a 0, and if the atoms are on the right side, then it's a 1. Then you have literally expressed information in a physical means. In fact, if you remove that boundary, you have that gas pushes to the other side like a piston. And so when that happens, you have extracted energy, or precisely you have Boltzmann constant times the natural log of 2 joules. So you've actually extracted energy from just information. But the question is now, how much energy does it, for example, take to force it into a 0-1 state? If you want to convert energy back into information, energy is always conserved, so you would have to push the piston with 2 joules, and you get the state again, 0 and 1. You can force it onto the one side or push the divider the other way, and you get it to the 0. So why is this relevant? Because when we start talking about physical equations in terms of AI or in these higher level cognitive or biological systems, it's not necessarily, we're not certain that these basic principles which apply to basic physical systems, elementary systems of bunch of particles in a box, we're not sure if that actually scales up to things like the brain or abstract information like the internet or cryptography or horse betting. But what I want to convince you today, and one of the core components of neuro AI, and to make it universal, as a universal model of intelligence, is that I want to show that actually this physical phenomenon, which applies when things are very small, actually scales up beautifully like a fractal onto larger systems. And that physical theories and all these equations used in thermodynamics are actually equally applicable to these larger ones. So now I think it's important for us to talk about Carl Friston. And Carl Friston is also not universally accepted as having a theory of the brain or intelligence. But what I really admire about Carl Friston is how much of physics he takes into discussing matters of the mind. And I hope, and this is not a rehash here of basically what Friston is saying, but I think it's really important for me to present on him before I can make my argument about the scalability. So what does Friston think about life? So for Friston, life is essentially a mechanism by which certain types of organisms or certain types of things, category of things, can temporarily defy entropy or an internal entropy so that they can temporarily defy the overwhelming tendency of the universe to finally be in complete disorder. So life is actually this thing in which, by preserving certain states that keep it in a homostatic system, by acting and predicting the right ways, it's able to survive and not just decay into the gas that spreads around your room. And a really good example of this is if you ever put a sausage or a frozen sausage in a microwave for 30 minutes, it's going to start cooking. And entropy increases and it's being less lifelike. If you put your hand in a low temperature microwave or a low temperature oven, it's not going to cook. And in fact, by the end of the process, your hand would probably still be fine, maybe a little warmer. But that just shows you how this interconnected system of your body is actually something that's keeping a homeostatic state. So the question is, what is the basic picture of life? And I love this diagram, and this is actually one of my favorite diagrams. It's from one of the early Friston papers, where essentially life is defined by Markov blankets. So what I mean by this is, imagine you had a cell, and the cell has a cell wall, which is everything that separates everything inside the cell, all the cool functions that are working and predicting for what the cell should do next. And you have everything else, which is the outside world. It prevents, so that Markov blanket is this layer, and this is an actual mathematical layer or statistical layer in which the outside world cannot impact the interior sort of model or function of the organism without having to go through an intermediate independent variable. So you would have to impact this boundary variable, or the beta here, the blanket variable, to actually have an effect on internal variable. And the internal variable, on the other hand, to affect the outside, must go through its own blanket, must go through an action, as opposed to sensing from the outside world. It must act upon the other outside world using your skin, or the fact that your brain has a skull to hold it. You have arms that interact with the outside world, but your brain is its own internal model. And the really beautiful thing about this is now we have a very nice, clean thermodynamic, or physics, really deeply physical way of stating what life is, that we can actually apply this to a lot of different cases and see how they apply. And that this blanket itself is almost like diffractal-like scaling. Because if you think about cells, there might be many blankets to the different Golgi bodies, the mitochondria, which have their own blankets within the cell as independent things. And the cell has a blanket in which it interacts with other cells. So you have organs or plants or mushrooms. And that's a blanket of blankets, and people are blankets of blankets, blankets of blankets of blankets. This really scales up. Question is, how do these organisms learn? And fundamentally what we do is we're trying to create a really good estimation of what's going on out there, despite only getting certain categories of information. So let's take the example. Imagine you're a cell. You have to survive, and to survive, you have to exist in a particular temperature. Based on the cell's sensory organs or sensory receptacles, you want to try to predict what temperature is actually outside. So how do we do this? How do we predict anything? We take a Bayesian estimation. And based on the sensory inputs that the cell's receiving, we want to see what the probability of a temperature being a certain value is. Here's the problem. Temperature and just about everything in the world is the continuous function. So you're going to get an intractable integral. And there's actually no way to actually compute this Bayesian probability. So what are we stuck with? We're stuck with having to formulate a world or approximation of that integral. We have to actually build a model of the world and see how well it lines up. If it lines up really well, then we made a really good model and can survive for longer. If you made a really bad model, then you're dead. So how do we measure how well the models line up? This is something called surprise. And surprise it's a very abstract term, and it's denoted by the negative log of the probability. And the idea about surprise is that if you're experiencing something unexpected, then the surprise is going to be very high. And ultimately what you want to do is you want to minimize your surprise. You want to build a model that's so good that you're not really surprised that you're encountering something that is shocking to you. Or, for example, if you're in a really hot room, you don't want to be surprised that it's actually very cold, that you feel very cold. And that would be a surprisal or a measure of difference. And I want you to pay attention to this here. Whereas if you took the expected value of this term, you'll notice that we actually end up with entropy again. So the expected value of surprise itself, this measure of how different the world is from you, is actually closely, if not the same overall idea as entropy, which is a very physical idea, but is also an abstract one. So we got this world model. We want to create a model called G density, and we want to use G density to approximate the actual conditions of the world outside. The problem is, how do we actually measure this? We have another neat mathematical tool, which is KL divergence. We can actually see how different these two distributions are over time. And if you see how different these two distributions are given a different drastically different sensory states, or given the same sensory state and we get drastically different results, then we're trying to minimize scale divergence. And when you add the expected sort of scale divergence, the difference between the two models of what's actually out there and what's here, we notice that, and we add that to surprise, then we get something called free energy. And when Friston talks about, and I'm sure many of you have heard Friston speak somewhere on a YouTube video or live, where he says that goal of life is to minimize free energy. This is what he means. It's that free energy is the upper bound of surprise. It's the surprise over time. It's the surprise over the complete difference in two models. So we must make a model. We must calculate the free energy, and we have to minimize it. Question is, that means that your reality or your apprehension of reality can be really anything. It could be completely bizarre from what's actually out there. Outside of the cell wall could be a complete world of unknowns. What you have access to is your internal state. But let's take a look here at the Huygens principle. Around 20 years ago, they built a new bridge somewhere in the world. I think it might have been in New Zealand or Australia, where it was a $2 billion bridge. And the moment people started walking on, the bridge started shaking and wobbling uncontrollably. And it's because when you have a mass of people going on a bridge, people synchronize their footsteps. And even though these people are entirely separate, the fact that they're connected by just visual cue, by the sound of footsteps, by the bridge itself, by oscillating a little bit every time you walk on it, people actually start synchronizing. And this is something that Huygens realized in his synchronicity principle, where when you put two plots on the same beam, pendulum plots, they actually start swaying the same. And they actually use this as a way to get clocks on the ship where it's constantly wobbling to synchronize. So yes, we never see reality and we never really construct it. However, the difference is because everything is synchronized, because your Markov boundary is in contact with the outside and in contact with your inside, what happens is that your internal model, that sort of fractal thing that I'm trying to argue for, and which I'll show in a bit, is actually synchronized to the dynamics of the outside. So there is this really beautiful synchronicity happening between outside events and internal events. And that keeps going down to the walls within walls, blankets within blankets. And the most beautiful part of this theory is that you have an affinity to other physical systems. Like you and the octopus are similar in how you compute, because there is a foundational physical principle behind how you are actually training models. And AIs are related to living horses and how they think. AIs are related to you. You are related to the horses. And this is a very Platonic argument that I'm trying to make. I am a Platonicist myself, but I'm arguing for this sort of like transcendental Platonic position in which everything is actually everything lines up with this symmetry, this self-similarity. And that your brain is actually formed the same way. You are formed in different lobes, in streams, and different ways of separating input. And each of these different components have their own Markov blanket, yet they come together to synthesize a larger blanket, a larger system in which it is capable of doing really remarkable things. So to summarize so far, and before I get to the really exciting part, I want to talk about, let's summarize what we have so far. So we know that information is a physical idea because all information is instantiated physically. Information is abstract because that same physical concept or that same set of physical equations can be used to talk about things that are not atoms in a box. And we also know that life is intimately connected with this thermodynamic principle, and that life can be viewed itself as a physical system and viewed as an informational system, and that Markov blankets can stack and stack through a self-similar way. When I talk to thermodynamicists about Friston theories, they're not as convinced because they work with only microcanonical ensembles, or they only work with essentially atoms and boxes. And they don't know if it's really true that things scale up. But I do think things scale up, and there's good reasons for it. This is where fractals come in. And this is why I really want to talk about fractals. And you might think, what the heck does fractals have to do with intelligence? This is just about the most far off thing. But I promise you, there's something here. And immediately we can tell about fractals is that they're clearly not normal shapes. They have this sort of very unique geometric property, and they're also found in a lot of places. And the reason why I chose these pictures is that this tree, for example, is a natural thing. And a lot of trees in nature actually follow the same self-similar patterns. This is a Romanesca broccoli, which is a naturally fractal. It's a very beautiful fractal object that you can eat for dinner, and it tastes really amazing. Fractals aren't quite normal shapes. They scale in different ways. For example, the way we would represent dimensionality in a fractal is saying, if you wanted to take the case of a Sierpinski's triangle, for example, we want to say that 3 copies are created every time this dimension is doubled. So to do that, we say, okay, we can actually express this dimensionality as a division of blondes or a ratio of blondes. So now we can work with spaces in a more abstract way. We don't have to work with normal shapes. And this is where physical chemistry is going to come in, because the question is, how does liquid travel through a material, for instance? If you ever had a coffee filter, how does the water drip from the coffee onto the bottom of the cup, through the filter, through the ground? And there's a fundamental physical problem called percolation. It's how do things actually percolate through or go through a system? And this is it's more of a mathematical study than a material science study, because in the end, percolation is a problem of whether sites are occupied by the liquid going through, whether certain bonds are being created given sort of the physical condition. And the beautiful thing about percolation is you can treat literally everything as dots in space that connect to other dots, or whether something makes a connection with another node of the graph or not. And that there's actually universality classes to this, that we're not just working with specific materials. You can actually reduce these materials to different probabilities, to different types of lattices, chemical bonds, to different types of shapes. And you can actually start making thresholds for when does a system, for instance, percolate? Like, when does the water actually go through the coffee ground? When does the water actually seep through the floor of your house into the groundwater? At which point, for instance, does water become ice? Which becomes a very complicated physical problem. So there are 2 types of percolation. The first one is site percolation. And this is about, okay, given that I occupy a certain square, what's the probability of my neighboring squares also being occupied? And there's another type is bond percolation, which is, okay, given that I have a site here, what's the probability of me connecting to this next bond, or forming a bond with the neighboring particle? And ultimately, these are about the same idea. It's measuring phase changes. At what point does my solid turn into liquid? And for the most part, you're solid. No matter what temperature, like this table, it's not going to melt unless it passes a certain temperature. Or at what point does water freeze? If you're consistently below 0 degrees Celsius, you're consistently below, it's never going to melt, or given a certain pressure. But the question is, what about these edge cases? What if you're right in between melting and freezing, or right in between evaporization and condensation, right before the water starts to boil? That's a whole range of random phenomenon. There's a very chaotic point in which you have to model, hey, when do these bonds start forming? And what's the significance of the point? What happens when you're at the threshold? What if you get the threshold? What are you supposed to see? So that's the absolutely most mind-blowing thing ever. It's at the percolation thresholds, at these phase changes, at these sorts of points in which things percolate, self-similarity emerges. And this is like an accident of nature or something, because you look at this as a percolation cluster, but it's at the threshold. And you can see it's already self-similar. It's already forming itself inside. And the closer you get to that percolation threshold, which, by the way, is very hard to compute, this is the lowest state of energy required to keep a certain state. And this starts percolating like crazy, and you get self-similar designs. And that's why in nature, you get the same thing. Let's talk about a blood vessel system, for instance. In a blood vessel system, the question is, there is so much intricate cardiovascular design, but how is it able to cover so much area, like a space-filling curve, while taking up so little total surface area? How is it able to cover so much fractal area? How is it able to color everything in and store this mile-long system into this very small space? And that's because bifurcation is a natural instinct of nature. It's not only the minimum energy required for a certain state to exist. But it also, if you think about a space filling curve, it's how you can maximally pack that design or distance or structure into the most minimum amount of surface area. You expand if you were to take a 1 and flatten it, it would be the size of a tennis court. And you could still see the different trachea and bifurcations and alveolars of the 1. Or my favorite example is actually a frozen car window. I take a lot of pictures of these, but this one I found online because this is a really beautiful picture in which the moment the water starts dripping down from the car and it gets frozen, it's like the minimum state, required state for a phase transition. So you're actually seeing the frozen version of percolation that's just happened. So the brain does this too, because we know that there's these streams that exist. And we really want to be able to explore first, it's efficient to do so. It's a natural phenomenon. But the second reason why is I think there's actually a really solid processing, computationally poignant processing reason for this. And if you were to take, for example, a brain scan, like an fMRI scan or something like that, and you were to voxelize it, create adjacency matrix, matching the relation between each area to another area of the brain, you can form the same graphs. And you'll tend to see that most of these graphs end up forming small world networks, which is not completely random, but you have these clusters of nodes together. Yet it's still overall, on the most part, sparse. But you have clusters. Because you can actually make the brain into a graph, you can actually investigate it in terms of a graph. And there's this really beautiful nature study that was done around 3 to 4 years ago, where they actually studied schizophrenic brains and normal brain. And the difference between the schizophrenic brain and the normal brain is that the schizophrenic brain is actually overly connected. If you were to group voxelize all these scans of schizophrenic patients, and you were to compare them with the normal patient, and you were to run a minimum spanning tree, what's the shortest distance to travel across all these nodes, you would find the schizophrenic one is overly connected. There's connections that don't need to exist. There is less major components. And what a major component is, if you remove that component, then a lot of things become disconnected, or it's the thing that, when removed, creates the most disconnection. And so even how your brain processes and how you perceive things consciously, whether you're hallucinating or whether you're in a normal state, is dependent on how optimal your connection is. So there's something there. So finally, I'm going to talk about my own work. And this is the part I left the least amount of time to. And the reason being is I'm not allowed to talk about a lot of it. The second reason being, the reason why I'm not allowed to talk about it is because it's currently being written for grants. So once the paper comes out, I hope I can do another talk and I can talk in detail about the study here. The other reason is I think it's so important to actually advocate for this field in the way that I'm seeing it, because I had a lot of pushback on on this idea of neuro AI, because it's somehow biological, it's an imperfect system, it's an evolutionary accident, and that we shouldn't take this sort of investigation seriously. Where what I want to do here is prove to you and convince you that there is a physical reason for this instantiation of intelligence called the brain. That there is a really beautiful symmetry that exists in the brain that we can investigate, that we can apply everywhere. So what I want to talk about now is, so what do? How am I trying to integrate this fractal-like design into AI? I think, again, with the neuro AI, there's three major components. The first one is self-supervision. The second one is streamification. We process things in parallel. We process things through different things that are different, have different tasks. And we want to make it in such a way so that, for example, certain streams are aggregated from other streams and have a priority. This is a more important stream. And this is actually an idea that was really early in computer science and in AI, where it used to be a cybernetic and psychological field. If you go back to the first neural network model of Merculo and Pitts, and you looked at this really funny interview of Merculo. It was in the 50s and he was naked, which is really funny because it was the 1950s, but it gives you a sort of idea of how radical that personality in person was. He was talking about things in terms of streams. He actually talks about the Greek idea of the rivers merging together to make a large river. So there's a path of prior work, and this prior work, so the idea of streams isn't new. From 2014, we already have supervised machine learning paradigms in which we're actually taking slow and fast networks and we're giving, for example, one stream an optical flow design or optical flow data, which is motion data, and we're only giving the other stream just images from the video, and it's able to predict the action in video pretty well. And then you start getting to things such as, slow fast networks of video recognition, where you, instead of just saying this is optical flow, we simply sample things at a different rate. And when we do that, we artificially create a motion and action recognition and object detection stream. And where it gets really interesting, and the part that I'm really going to stress for the last few minutes, is the idea behind contrasted predictive coding, and especially through dense predictive coding. And these are self-supervised learning frameworks that I believe are the foundation of artificial intelligence of the future, of something we can actually scale in a different way, through a streamified way. The question is, why do we study the visual cortex? I think I can summarize this slide really briefly. If you take a brain of any mammal and you were to chop it, if you were to chop it at the auditory cortex and you chop the visual cortex and you put it on a slide, you would not be able to tell which one's the auditory and which one's the visual. And that's really fascinating because it says, oh, wow, there is this replicable motif. There is this sort of symmetry. There's this fractal-like replication that's going on. And so what I want to do is study the visual cortex because it's the most well-studied one. Not only have we mapped all the Brodmann areas, but we also have a really good idea of actually how well current AI vision models match with the visual cortex, because we can actually create a one-to-one mapping at sea. And to make this brief, but transformers actually don't do a very good job of mapping with what the brain does in terms of the visual cortex, even though they're used. So we're stuffing a lot of data, but that efficiency is a different question. So what are things we can do with this? First, we use the most biologically sound backbone we know to date, which is a ResNet. And ResNets are very powerful models because they have skip connections. And actually, one of the most remarkable things about GPT is that it also uses skip connections. You're able to run this gradient across a really deep network in the similar way to actually how the brain does its computation. So when we don't do back propagation, but we do predictive coding, different layers of the brain are getting skip connections, and that's how it learns. So ResNet, in a way, is cheating by skipping through all these layers, and actually propagation is really only happening, or learning is really happening at one layer. We take a sound backbone, we view split. If we can do view splitting, for example, we can split the left and right hemispheres. As I was talking about earlier, the left and right sides of your world are completely split when it first enters your visual field. We could input split, for example, M and P cells, which are fast and slow cells. So M cells respond only to fast moving objects, only to motion, and P cells only respond to slow sustained input. And by splitting this in terms of input, hopefully we get different types of functions. We get a motion stream and an object detection stream. And maybe through these streams, we can actually add heads or attention heads or multiplicative heads and all these sorts of things to actually get them to form logical relationships. So this is reasoning without language. This is an unconscious origin of intelligence. And finally, what's most important is self-supervision. What we want to do is we want to learn a latent space. We don't want to just predict what's out in the world. We want to predict a really good, concise, and useful representation of the world. So the question is, what is latent space? Latent space is when you have a function mapping input to an abstract vector. And this vector is then can be used for a variety of tasks. Because it's so informationally rich, it's able to, for example, do clustering, it's able to do classification, it's able to be used for multimodal tasks. And you're able to actually reconstruct the input if you really wanted. For example, if you gave you a picture of an apple, you would be able to redraw that apple. And this is something that Jan LeCun is very passionate about. And if you ever look at his world models, it's all about predicting the latent space. How can we make a good representation? Then through this self-supervised learning, try to predict the future of these latent spaces. I throw a ball at you and you're expecting the ball. And so you raise your hands to catch the ball. And since the ball is already in the air, you've already created latent space. You're not modeling each pixel or each firing a neuron of the ball going towards you. What you're modeling is that latent idea of that the ball has this motion, has this vector trajectory, and this is happening. And if people are trying to ask questions about how can we ground AI or large language models in reality, this is how you do it. Because essentially, not only do we have explainable AI to streamification, you're actually learning in something that comes before language. You're learning something so informationally dense that words can't possibly capture a ball flying towards you. In fact, it's evoking this already stored latent representation inside your mind. And so this is why I'm working with something from 2019. This is really old, but the idea behind dense predictive coding is that you're essentially trying to predict future latent spaces of video by finding things that don't fit. For example, if this doesn't come in the right time slot or this doesn't come in the right space, then clearly this can't be the next sample that we want. So this sort of future prediction, there is work on predicting future latent space. Hopefully, this isn't playing, but hopefully we're able to work with the basic examples of moving digits and start seeing with these super simple data sets the beginnings of universal architecture for intelligence. This is for this sort of work I'm doing where I am creating streams and having this sort of self-supervised framework separate itself into streams. What is the most energy efficient way, or what is the most logical way for these streams to actually find their own task? It's 3 different blind men trying to touch an elephant and trying to see what creature it is. You have someone who's touching the tail, someone who's touching the trunk, and someone who's touching the legs. And they're all describing the feature and only getting a part of it. In the end, they have to naturally segregate into different agents saying, oh, yes, given your information and given how it's synthesized here, now I know this is an elephant. So I hope this is I'm being very cautious at the time, and I notice it's 2:50. So that's my presentation, and I hope I've convinced you why this is really important. And I hope the next time I am able to talk about it, I can give you a paper, and it's a very solid paper that I'm allowed to share.
Thank you so much. I think that is possibly the clearest explanation of Markov blankets and some of the Friston ideas that I've heard in a really long time, honestly. Thanks a lot. That was really insightful. I loved how you connected the dots. And I think it's a really interesting research domain that Closet has had a little bit of dabbling in. Like we funded a workshop in that area and so forth. So it's really cool to see that. Thank you so much. Okay. Are you ready for questions?
Yeah, completely ready. Yes.
Okay. If you have a question, please feel free to raise your hand. And okay, we already have Micah with a question. Yeah, it was a great.
Some people believe that any AI model that you design could be replicated by a very simple but very large just MLP, right? The idea being that given enough training data, it will eventually find the ideal solution. Do you disagree with that? Or do you think that is this the goal of designing up front being so you can maybe skip ahead, save yourself a whole lot of time training? Or do you think that maybe it won't settle on this ideal design and it'll settle to find some other local maxima and not be able to get here?
So I love that question. And that's for 2 reasons. The first one is I like to tell a rather comical story of, yes, you can do a physics simulation or fluid dynamics simulation with an abacus, but you would never choose to do it with an abacus. You could do it if you had maybe millions of people lined up doing abacus computations, but it's a very inefficient and slow way to get there. And second, yes, you can theoretically have a recurrent network, throw things at it, and have it learn a Turing-complete program. But the question is, I want to understand what's actually going on. Part of this discovery, it's not just I want to throw data at something and I want to expect it to be able to do cool things. I want to understand the mechanism so that we can do it efficiently, so that we can do it in a way in which we actually understand what's happening, so we can scale it even further. And in fact, I do believe that if you were to do things, the brain is such a complex organism. Some of these intelligent phenomenon is so convoluted and complicated that the best way to go about actually creating it at the level it's at is to study the architecture of it. So yes, it's possible, but it's a question of why would you do fluid dynamics with an abacus? You wouldn't.
So if I understand correctly, the idea is that we already have a model that seems to work really well, and we should start there rather than starting with nothing, basically, in MLP. And the model we have being the brain, right? So you've already got brains, human brains. They've already spent millions of years of evolution figuring out a really good solution. We should start from there and then work on iterating to make it better rather than starting from nothing and trying to find an alternative that maybe is better.
Yes, and furthermore, part of the whole physics was about that the brain is not an accident. It's not just one instance of a good model. It's actually, there is a physical sort of justification for why it's so good. And the key is to notice these sorts of justifications.
We're getting 100% mic up. All right, next one up. Does anyone else have a question? Okay, then I'm going to go ahead, unless someone interrupts me by asking a question and just raising your own hand. Like, I love that you combine so much like abstract thinking and like clearly like foundational thinking with some possible practical outlooks. If you think about if more people adopted this type of framework, or if this became a little bit more, widely spread, like how would like the neurotech AI world look differently in 5 to 10 years? What is like interesting about this that would have like real world implications, let's say 10 years around?
Yeah. So the first thing is I think science in the States is a very distracted endeavor because we're always motivated by, okay, we're seeing some promise in this, or we're throw a lot of money at this, and hopefully it gives us good results. And that's usually where scientific funding goes. Unfortunately, if people were to take sort of foundational ideas seriously like this, like universal categories of symmetry, physics of intelligence, I think we'd go a lot further in 5 years. You'd be spending a lot less energy, like physical energy, computing all this stuff. You'd be advancing, and you'd just be tackling the problem in a targeted way, and there'd be less distraction. But what I really want to do is I want to get to the core of this and hopefully be able to develop a new sort of a new science of intelligence.
That is quite an ambitious goal. Do you have are there any bottlenecks onto that path that you foresee? If someone new was entering the field, got really excited about this, are there any fruitful research directions where you're like, oh, these are a few open questions. If we had more brain power on them, like we could only hack them?
It's actually money for foundational research because you see there's a lot of money going to AI, but it's all going to a particular thing. It's all going to I'm scaling. And it's really unfortunate because there's actually such good work being done. It's still the minority. There's some on MIT. There's some where I am. There's some on the coast. But for the most part, it's a lot of money, and it's just a lot of smart people who are not thinking about it. Who I do think, for example, Ilya Sutskever is a really brilliant person, but he also makes claims such as these papers are the only papers you need to read to know what's exciting right now. And it's the transformer paper and his own sequence to sequence model. But that isn't really doing anyone justice in terms of tackling the foundational problem. It's distracting.
I guess as the field like grows, people are looking more in more niche areas. Like I think you see like a little bit of movement into these areas at least, but it's still quite slow on this one way to.
But it's important for safe AGI, especially this. And I think you can noodle around with the transformer model all you want, but I expect to see some catastrophic consequences in regards to not just even non-intelligent things becoming dangerous. It's a real possibility.
And you think that this type of framework can prevent it better just because it has a more holistic understanding of intelligence?
It's discernible, it's separable, it's explainable. Yeah.
Yep. It might require us to rebuild a bunch of stuff. And
yeah.
But so there is definitely, I guess, some hidden incentive for people to just like march along the path that they currently on until it goes no further. But yeah, I think that's how often these revolutions get made over time. Nick, if you can unmute, feel free to ask the question yourself. Otherwise, I'm going to read it out. That's okay.
Sure. Unfortunately, I'm not well versed in these topics, which I'm going to mention right now. I was wondering if you've heard of Sumio Watanabe's work in, I believe, singular learning theory, and there's an AI safety agenda called developmental interpretability. Perhaps I'm just reminded of these because they both harken to thermodynamics and I think some statistical mechanics. But I want to know if you've heard of them, and if so, how do they relate
seem to be frozen for a second.
Oh,
please repeat.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Okay. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah, I can hear you now. Yes.
Okay. Okay. Great.
Are you
yes,
speaking?
Yeah. Hello.
Yeah, I think maybe Zan, you might be frozen. I'm gonna turn off my video. I'm gonna turn off my video that we can see if it goes better. Thanks, Sienna. The sun is hard to triangulate who is frozen on the Zoom call. But please try to repeat, Nick. Let's give it another shot.
Sure. And unfortunately, I'm not well versed in these topics. I'm just getting into them. But your talk reminded me of
We
an
lost
AI
Sam.
safety. Oh,
You're speaking
wow.
into the void. Sorry, Nick.
Maybe someone else can answer. At least ask a question. We'll see until we get some back.
Sure. So perhaps anyone has heard of the AI safety agenda called developmental interpretability, and it's related with they draw on Sumio Watanabe's work in, I believe, singular learning. Oh, I think Zan's back. Okay, I'll repeat my question perhaps. And so I'm not sure if you've heard of these fields. I'm just getting into them. And there's an AI safety agenda called developmental interpretability and Sumio Watanabe's work of singular learning theory. And perhaps I was just reminded of them because they both are related with thermodynamics work. I'm wondering if you've heard of them, and if so, if they're related to your work.
Oh, I actually never heard of them, but thank you for bringing this up. I'll definitely look into this. And I've never heard about this, but that's good that you bring it up. And I'm happy that people are thinking about interpretability in terms of this, because when I work on this, I'm thinking about how can I make, better intelligence, and interpretability isn't on my mind, but I think that's really wonderful. Oh, and I love how it's called Timaeus. Someone said that the word is called Timaeus, and that's beautiful. That's one of my favorite books by Plato. So again, with the theme of having a transcendental Platonicism, I really admire.
Yeah, wonderful. I just
Yeah.
posted the agenda here also in the chat if people want to read up on it. And I don't know, Zan, if you can stay one more minute.
Yeah, no, I got time.
Okay, yeah, Marina had a question a while ago. So maybe Marina, if you want to unmute yourself, feel free to do so. Otherwise, I will ask you.
Yeah, I was just wondering, thank you for the talk. It was really complicated for a medical person. Nevertheless, I was thinking in the end, you told that you want to study the visual cortex. And I wonder if these latent models or latent spaces are actually built in the visual cortex, because the brain has lots of highly specialized regions like visual or auditory cortex. But I'm not really sure that these complex models are actually built exactly there.
Yeah, so that's definitely right. What I mean by the visual cortex is that the latent spaces are being generated from the visual cortex.
Yeah.
As in the actual where you store a lot of these latent spaces are ideas in the brain. They could be where the words are or where semantics are. But the idea is that I want to learn. So using the visual cortex and going through this entire stream of processing, and sort of going through all the steps of this and creating that latent space. The latent space isn't part of what the visual cortex do. The visual cortex is simply responsible for part of the process of actually processing the sensory data and getting it to a place where it's able to be used as a latent space, or being able to be used even later through more processing as a latent space. But the latent space is being simply used as a scaffolding for the stream to differentiate, for some sort of representation of the world. So when we build a visual cortex model, the very end of this net or neural net or this structure is approximating what the rest of the brain is doing, which is poor at the current moment, but hopefully someday we'll get multimodal models and we'll get very sophisticated stream stacking to a point where we can actually do similar to what the brain does. I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful.
Yeah.
We'll have to leave it at this, but that was really great. I hope that we get to welcome you again when you actually have some of the data to show that it's
Yeah.
that was really interesting. Thanks a lot for taking us on this ontological tour. I really appreciate it. Thanks everyone for your great questions, and I hope to see you all for the next one. Thank you.